Hi guys, this is week 12 of the Backyard Basics series. I was kind of hoping that we would all be back to training by now, so I didn't plan out my videos in a super systematic way. I just kind of made what I was feeling at the time, or if I got some questions, I'd focus on that. I think for this next chunk of time, because we finished with the Lignature Sword and Buckler series, I'm going to run you through kind of the 12 class beginner curriculum we do at the Santa Cruz Club. This is designed to be an overview so that by the end of the 12 weeks, you're familiar with kind of the most basic concept in terms and positions. You're not intended to be an expert, but this is intended so that when you jump into the intermediate classes, you're not completely lost. So just keep in mind that this is an introductory series. If you have been studying already, then these videos might not be as helpful. If you're looking to get into longsword, particularly the German longsword, this might be helpful. This is just how we do it. So what I have people start with, of course, is stance and footwork. So I like to take a very kind of individual method for people's stances. So I just tell them to take about a shoulder width stance. I like to have them put their non-dominant, so if you're righty, you're gonna put your left foot forward, turn your back foot in about 45 degrees, bend your knees along your toes, make sure that the weight is more or less on the ball of your feet so that you can shift your way back and forth. But for now, we're gonna stay with a fairly central balanced stance. We're not gonna be very heavy over one side or the other. That's gonna come later. As a super quick review, because all the way back at the beginning of this Backyard Basics thing, I already covered the footwork in more in depth. I'm just gonna remind you, so on day one, we work on finding our stance, and I introduce people to kind of the three basic steps. So the first one is the shuffle step. I'm gonna push off the back foot, land on the ball of foot, and recover back to my stance. And so we'll just have people shuffle forward, and then shuffle back, kind of looking down to make sure that they're keeping their stance. I have them switch their feet, and we have them do it again, pushing off the back foot, landing on the ball of foot, pushing off the front foot, landing on the ball of the foot, always looking down to make sure that we're staying in our stance. We don't want to step out and then recover shorter because we're going to find ourselves really long. Or more commonly, people will step out and then recover too much, and now their feet are really close together and they're not in balance. So if you're practicing this, just make sure that however far you step out is how far you recover. The next step is the passing step. It's exactly what it sounds like. This is the more walking step. We just want to make sure that we're passing our hips. The most common mistake I see with beginners doing this is they start to gate and swing. We don't want that. So you want to make sure that, essentially I like to joke in the club that everything is a Hadouken body mechanic. So if I start a little turn, this lets my hips square as I move. So my feet are passing fairly close together, forward and back. I studied traditional martial arts for a long time, so if you find yourself crescent stepping a little bit, that's better than the gate. Right? Don't gate. So if you find yourself crescent stepping a little bit, that's all right, but ideally we're just gonna let our hips square as we pass through, forward and back. And then the last step is the offline step. I like to teach this in a combination, and this is just where we're gonna take our back foot, we're gonna step out to about parallel, then we're gonna pivot away. So now our stance is reversed and we're facing the line. Then we step out, we pivot back. Now we're back on our line. Step and pivot, step and pivot. So before a beginning person at the club ever picks up a sword, we work on finding their stance, and we work on those three basic steps because they're gonna show up forever. If they've gotten that far, and we usually spend about half an hour on this, but if they've gotten that far, we let them pick up a sword. And we talk about the parts of the sword. I'm gonna kind of skip that. There are lots of good videos on that. So for us, the next thing that they learn is a basic guard flow. So because I want them to get used to the position. So we're gonna have them start in a Baumtag. And I'm not too worried about if it's the above the head or it's the answering the telephone on the shoulder one. I don't let people start with it resting on their shoulder though. I think it can lead to some bad habits if you don't already know how to cut. But the nice thing about the over the head version is you can cut to both sides pretty well. So we have Baumtag, and then we're gonna shuffle step, and we're gonna roll into the ox position. I like the horizontal quillions to catch things coming in, thumb is underneath. We're gonna thrust, turning our hips, palm up, and then we're gonna step forward and we're gonna wind. Now we're on the left Baumtag. Go up to plow, thrust, thumb on top, to the other plow, step forward and drop down to Alber, and then we're gonna come back up to Baumtag. And then they'll just spin around. We do this backwards later, but for now I'll do it backwards for now, but usually with the new people, we just have them going forward. Okay, so we'll work on the guard flow. And so it starts out with me calling them doing them with them, unless I have one of the more advanced students, and then they'll do it with them, and I'll just stand to the side and call. And then we'll ask them to call so that they're learning a little bit of the names along with the actual motions. We spend a little bit of time on that. I joke with them that they have now learned their first longsword kata, and that's a good milestone for them. And if that's going well, and we've spent 15-ish minutes on that, we'll introduce cutting. We only work on an overhow, an overcut in the first lesson, and we actually start with half cuts. So in Meyer, he talks about half cuts, which is the cutting to the long point, and then the full cuts, which cuts through long point to one of the changing positions. When I started teaching, I taught full cuts first, and I found that a lot of students had trouble with cutting down. They would crunch their body, and they were pulling down, or they were kind of swinging like it was an axe. They weren't projecting very well. So what I started having people do is cutting to long point first, to really emphasize that we want people cutting out. So we want to have a nice, long, extended cut. We don't want to be crunched, we don't want to be shoving down into the dirt. So we have them start with what we call choppy the robot. So they're above the head, and we focus on just this part, getting the sword moving first, a little bit of a pivot in the back because everything's a Hadouken, and then we want the cut and the step to end at about the same time. And then they come up, and now we're going to cut slightly down from the left to long point, and then back up to long point, and then back up to long point. We'll have them spin initially. We don't have them cutting backwards at first, but I'm going to cut backwards just for the camera. So choppy the robot, from the right and from the left, we're just practicing those diagonal overcuts over and over and over again. We start with big motion. So everybody starts with choppy the robot, then we'll start cutting, pulling back to ox and cutting out of there on each side, and then we'll refine that even further to cutting from the little wheel, which is all in front of you. But we try to start with the biggest motions first so they can learn good cuts, and then we kind of bring everything down. So for lesson number 1, stance, footwork, basic guard flow number 1, overcuts, and then because I want people at least thinking about defense right away, we talk about the straight parry. So if I want to defend those overcuts coming from choppy the robot, I'm going to be in my long point, my right foot lead, and I want to make sure that I'm going to turn my point and edge so that their cut's going to slide down into the strong of my sword. So I'm just going to do this. If the person's having trouble with that, we'll talk about diffusing the back foot a little bit just to keep some extra good structure. And we talk about if I'm a 3-headed monster, we want to stab the head on this side. We don't want to push the hands over and leave the point behind. That parry will get blown through. So we talk about leading with the point and long edge so that we have nice structure. And then I'll have them switch their feet because it's easier to go to the open side, and we'll parry against the cuts from the other side, trying to do the same thing. If you're practicing this on your own and you have a pel, one thing you could do is line up with your long point directly on the pel, and when you parry, make sure that your point goes slightly to the left of the pel, and then slightly to the right of the pel, always catching with the long edge. And again, you're using your body. So one thing that we don't want to do is push over like this where my belly button's still pointed at the opponent. I don't have very good mechanical structure, so I want to turn my belly button a little bit so that my skeleton is supporting the parry and not just the muscles. Right? So once we have gone through stance, 3 basic steps, basic guard flow, choppy the robot, and straight parry, that's a lot of information. And so we stop there. That we usually spend 90 minutes to 2 hours on those things, and then I go back and forth between the new people and then whatever the intermediate level students are doing. If one of the more advanced students is there, luckily I can have them swap out so that the new people don't have to stop and wait for me. And then we keep building on that. So when a student comes to lesson 2, we'll review these things again, and then we'll add one more thing. And so every week the student comes, if they come every week, which is ideal, they get a review and then one more thing. We go through 12 weeks of that. So this week, because I did another Pel work video, we're going to stop with lesson 1. I think for the rest of the next few weeks, I'm going to cover 2 lessons, one each in a separate video, just so people can run through the curriculum and see how we start absolute beginners at the Santa Cruz Club. And if you have any questions,